The following is a presentation of Castle View Church in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Good morning. That's the sound check. There it is. Well, I want to thank you, Chris, for that prayer and for that introduction. Thank you, Chris Jude, as well, for that set of songs. Lifted my heart to the Lord. I hope it did yours as well. And I want to thank Castle View. And I want to thank the elders, even though they're not here. I want to express my gratitude for this invitation to preach. It's always humbling, and it's always a privilege to open the Word of God with the people of God. Amen. So we hear commonly that the world is changing very quickly around us. And if you open your eyes to the advancements of technology and social and political and cultural changes in the world, you can't deny that things are quite different than they were 50 years ago. I saw pictures of my mother and her family when they got their first television. And this thing was tiny. It was only about this big, but it was about that thick, and it was all black and white, and there were knobs on it, and she would tell me how excited she was and how amazing it was that they had images and sounds, news, and television shows right there in their living room, first time when they got a TV. And of course, they had to get up to change the channel. They had to get up to turn the volume down or turn the volume up, and they had 3 channels. And they thought, oh, we had 3 things that we'd choose from, right? Well, today, of course, our televisions are about this thin and this big. They're all in color. We have hundreds of channels, and nobody ever gets up for any purpose to change anything. Or some of you may remember your phones at home when you were growing up. I certainly remember mine. In the 80s, it was affixed to the wall, and you had to turn the dial like this and dial your friends. And at one time, somewhere in there, we got a really long cord that we could attach to the phone so we could walk into another room and still be on the phone. And we thought that was just the greatest thing, that now we could walk into another room and still be on the phone. Of course, these days, y'all are looking at me like, what? Cords attached to phones? Was it crazy? And in this last election cycle, we had our first a female candidate in a general election. It's just everywhere you look, things are quickly changing. But I was also struck this last week at how things also seem very much unchanged over the last 50 years. It occurred to me as I was watching Ken Burns' documentary, The Vietnam War, on PBS. Some of you no doubt watched that these last 2 weeks, 10-part documentary on the Vietnam War. And it just struck me how unchanged the world seems to be. Back in the 60s, we were concerned about the Soviet or the Russian threat, and that the Russians were pushing their influence into other countries. And so we got involved in skirmishes because of that. We had just gotten out of a war with North Korea, in which the Chinese exerted their influence and got involved in that war. Back home, there's all kinds of mistrust for leaders, particularly in the White House. Things they were saying, the American public knew they weren't being honest with us. And so there were all kinds of protests to voice their concern that the leadership of the country, particularly the White House, was not being honest with the people. And then there were all kinds of race issues, marches and protests, calls for equality across the land. It was the height of the civil rights movement. And in the 1968 Olympics, we saw how sports could also be involved in expressing people's political and social views when 2 African Americans on the podium to receive their medals lifted up their fists in a symbol of black pride, black power. And then the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. Well, as we look at the world today, Russia is still trying to exert its influence into other countries, and we're greatly concerned about that. We're still talking about North Korea, and in those discussions with North Korea, China is always part of the conversation. Again, there are marches and demonstrations where people are expressing their mistrust for the White House. And there are new marches and protests where people are expressing their concerns about racial inequality, and there are calls for equality. And we're seeing how sports can be drawn into the debate, thinking particularly of recent events in the NFL. There's even a voting commission. You would think in a democracy like our own, we've figured out voting by now, but now there's a voting commission because some people are saying people voted illegally, while other people are saying those who are legally allowed to vote are being denied. So everywhere you look, things are changing, but man, that documentary really struck me that no, we're still dealing with some of the exact same problems 50 years later. So I ask, why is this? How can this be that we are always changing and developing, yet fundamentally still the same? And I think the answer is to be found in the most primitive of places, the book of Genesis. So if you have your Bible, turn to Genesis 1. And in Genesis 1, right there, in verse 28, God says to the man and the woman, God blessed them, and God said to them, Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Theologians call this verse the cultural mandate, where God takes his image bearer and says, now you are to go out into the world and have dominion, and you are to develop culture, and you are to spread culture, and you are to progress the good things of the earth. Make things like light bulbs and buildings and roads and schools and political systems, and bring the earth into a cultural experience. And Adam and Eve and their descendants, you, will do that well if they heed the word of God, if they listen to their Creator and they obey their Creator. But we don't go very far in the book of Genesis before we discover that Adam and Eve disobey the word of God, don't they? So in Genesis chapter 3, we read the story of the serpent who comes into the garden, deceives Adam and Eve into thinking that maybe carving our own path, disobedience to God, would be better for us. They rebel against their Creator, and immediately the whole human race is plunged into the fall and plunged into a curse, where now thorns and thistles will be brought forth to frustrate humanity's cultural progress. And pains in childbearing will be introduced to frustrate their child rearing. But immediately, in Genesis 3, verse 15, immediately, as soon as humanity falls into this predicament, the Lord has a solution. Do you know Genesis 3:15? Is that commonly referred to here? I hope it is. Where the Lord says to the serpent, the deceiver, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. And here we go. He shall crush your head, and you shall crush his heel. This is the first announcement of the Messiah, where right away, as soon as Adam and Eve fall and are removed from the Garden of Eden through the deception of the serpent, God has a Messiah ready to go who will crush his head, reverse the effects of the fall, and bring humanity back to that place of obedience and righteousness, and therefore successful culture making. And so in my mind, that explains why we can see cultural progression in terms of technologies and the things we build, right? Because we still are called to bear that cultural mandate, to go out into the world, to subdue it, to make culture, to spread culture, to pass it on to the next generation. Yet we are corrupted. We are corrupted by sin. And wherever there's an opportunity to grab power and abuse power and use it for selfish ends, we will. And so we should expect to see some forms of progress, all the while humanity caught in the snare of its own willful rebellion against the Creator. The passage I want to look at with you this morning, though, is not Genesis. It's in the book of Psalms. Psalm 72 has an answer that furthers our understanding of how this can be and what are God's plans to put the world back to rights through that one seed who will crush the head of the serpent. That's what Psalm 72 is going to be about. So turn in your Bibles to Psalm 72. Nearly everything I say will come right out of Psalm 72, and you will be helped if you have it in your lap in front of you. Psalm 72. For Solomon. Now, some of your translations might say to Solomon, or of Solomon, or by Solomon. Hebrew prepositions are very fluid, but I think the right word is for Solomon, and I'll explain in just a moment why that is. For Solomon. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. Let the mountains bear prosperity for the people and the hills in righteousness. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor. May they fear you while the sun endures, and as long as the moon, throughout all generations. May he be like the rain that falls on the mowed grass, like showers that water the earth. In his days may the righteous flourish, and peace abound till the moon be no more. May he have dominion from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. May desert tribes come and bow down before him, and his enemies lick the dust. May the kings of Tarshish and of the coastlands render him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring gifts. May all kings fall down before him. All nations serve him. For he delivers the needy when he calls, the poor and him who has no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy and saves the lives of the needy. From oppression and violence he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight. Long may he live. May gold of Sheba be given to him. May prayer be made for him continually, and blessing invoked for him all the day. May there be abundance of grain in the land. On the tops of the mountains may it wave. May its fruit be like Lebanon, and may people blossom in the cities like the grass of the field. May his name endure forever, his fame continue as long as the sun. May people be blessed in him. All nations call him blessed. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who alone does wondrous things. Blessed be his glorious name forever. May the whole earth be filled with his glory. Amen and amen. The prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended. Now that's a unique way to end the psalm. There are 150 psalms, 150 poems and prayers of praise and lament and rejoicing to God, but only one of them, this one, ends with that peculiar sentence. The prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean that the prayers of Jesse are ended? If you keep reading in the Psalms, you'll see there are actually more Psalms by David. So it doesn't mean that they end now in the book. It means something like this, that this is likely David's last prayer. David, the king of Israel, knows that he's about to die. And so he prays for his son Solomon. That's why the superscript, verse 0 in your Bible, says, for Solomon. This is David's prayer for his son, and therefore for his kingdom, as David is about to go out of the world. And so that's likely what it means, that his prayers are now ended. These are his last great words. However, I think they mean something else, something additionally. And it is this, that this prayer of David here in Psalm 72 represents the grand summary of all of David's other prayers. What were David's other prayers all oriented toward? Or to put it another way, the final horizon of what David was all about. Why did God call David? What are God's purposes with David? How is he using King David in the history of Israel and in the history of the world? What is the point? And this prayer represents the end, the final horizon to which David's life and David's prayers are oriented. Right? So in this case, the word end doesn't simply mean last, but it means the goal or the purpose. The end for which God called David. Why would this be the end? Why would this be the goal? Why would this be the grand purpose and final horizon of David's hopes? That a son would reign like we just read? Well, because in 2 Samuel 7, you read that this afternoon, in 2 Samuel 7, sometimes I tell my students that this 2 Samuel 7 is the most important chapter in all the Bible for understanding the rest of the Bible. It bears this interpretive weight, and it casts a light over everything else. And in 2 Samuel 7, the Lord promises to David an eternal kingdom. That one of David's sons will sit on David's throne and rule over Israel forever. No other king in Israel has ever given that promise. David alone is told that your house, your line, your dynasty, one of your sons will rule in Israel forever. If you read it, there's an if. If he keeps my word, if he obeys my law, then he will be blessed and he will be established forever. But if he doesn't, then he will be disciplined with the rod of men. I will bring other nations to come bear and to chastise him for his disobedience. And as we just read in Psalm 2, did you notice that? That as the nations rage and the peoples plot a vain thing, let us cast their cords from us. Let us rebel against the Lord and against his anointed. The Lord has a solution to the rebellion against the nations. The nations have been rebelling and raging against God from the very beginning. But the Lord says, I have an answer for that. I have a solution to the raging of the nations. Ever since the fall, peoples have been going astray and rebelling against me. My solution is to place my son to rule over them. And some of them will submit, and some of them will not. But the view here is of all the nations of the earth. Therefore, in Psalm 2, the Lord is saying that son of David, who will rule over Israel in righteousness, will not only rule over Israel, he will rule over the whole world. And he will bring righteousness and justice to the world. For those who rebel, they will be judged. But for those who submit, they will be brought into the purview of his righteous and just rule over all the world. And so here we are in Psalm 72, and David is praying that his first son of Solomon, will have that experience. Will obey the Lord, unlike Adam, but will obey the Lord as commanded in 2 Samuel 7, and will therefore bring righteousness and justice to all nations. So that's what I think it means, that this is the end of David. One, it's the end of his life, and he's looking to the next generation of kings in his line. But also because that David's sons would eventually bring the world back into their original relationship with God is the goal for why David was called at all in the first place. And so David is praying that Solomon would initiate that program. The use of the word ends like that is not very common, but it is in a book that's about 200 years old by a guy named Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards wrote a book called The Ends for Which God Created the World. And he didn't mean the end of time. What he meant was the goal or the purpose. Why did God create the world? And Edwards' conclusion is that God created the world so that he could take his internal perfections, his glory, and demonstrate his glory publicly. And so that then rational creatures, those made in his image, human beings, would see his glory in the created order and worship him and enjoy him through the experience of God's glory in the world. And that's the reason why God created the world. That's the ends for which God created the world. Well, here in Psalm 72, David is saying, there's an end for which God created me. To give me this dynasty, to hand it over to one of my sons. The only one David can think of right now is his son Solomon, who will then rule in righteousness and bring the rebelling nations, the Gentile, idolatrous heathens of the world, into the righteous reign of the Son of David. And I want to look at Psalm 72 with you right now and explore what is the content of David's prayer. Okay? So we're going to do this in four parts. Number 1, verses 1 and 2, what is David's prayer for his son? What is the content of his prayer? What does David pray for his son? That's number 1, verses 1 and 2. What is David's prayer for his son? Then number 2, verses 3 through 17. What will happen to the people if the Lord answers David's prayer for his son? So verses 1 and 2 is what David actually prays. And then verses 3 through 17, it's a big section, but that's the way the psalm is organized. What will happen to the people if the Lord answers David's prayer for his son? Then number 3, why would the Lord answer this prayer? That's in verses 18 and 19. Verses 18 and 19, why would the Lord answer this prayer? And then finally, number 4, I want to ask the question, how has God answered this prayer, and when will God answer this prayer? So verses 1 through 2, what is David's prayer for his son? Verses 3 through 17, what will happen to the people if God answers that prayer? Verses 18 through 19, why would the Lord answer this prayer? And then finally, how has God answered this prayer, and how will he answer this prayer? So verses 1 and 2, what is the content of David's prayer? What, in a nutshell, is David asking for? It's actually a singular and therefore very simple request. Verses 1 and 2. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. That's it. It's a very simple, singular request that Solomon would be just and righteous. You see the word justice twice in these verses. You see the word righteousness twice in these verses. In other words, David is thinking back to 2 Samuel 7, saying, my kingdom will be established, my line will endure forever if my sons obey the law of God, if they rule with righteousness and justice, not as power-hungry, money-hungry, self-serving leaders, but with justice and with righteousness. That's his prayer. He doesn't pray for financial growth. He doesn't pray for bull markets. He doesn't pray that Solomon will be able to create jobs. He doesn't pray that he'll be able to secure the borders or to improve education or to lower taxes or to raise taxes. He has one singular prayer, that he would embody the righteousness of the Lord. Do you notice that in verse 1? He says, give the king your justice, God, your justice. Throughout the Old Testament, God is described time and time again as being holy and righteous and just. He does everything right. He does everything on the moral up and up. No one can accuse him of evil or having treated anybody unfairly. He doesn't play favorites. He is completely righteous and completely just in all that he does. And David is saying, Lord, will you take that moral attribute that characterizes yourself and instill it into Solomon? that he would know the good, the true, the beautiful, the fair, the equitable, the just, and the righteous. That he would not cheat, that he would not lie, he would not abuse power, he would not deceive. These are the opposites of justice and righteousness. The concern is moral. It is moral. It's not economic, which is surprising. Should be surprising to us. Political leaders talk all the time in economic terms. He's talking in moral terms. That he will be honest, that he will be zealous for even balances. But particularly, look at verse 2. He says, may he judge your people with righteousness. To judge in this context does not mean set up shop at the courthouse, but to lead, to guide, to give judgments, to make decisions on behalf of the people. And, verse 2, your poor with justice. It is very common within political systems that the poor get the last seat at the table. They're the last ones to have their concerns heard. It's those who are economically empowered who are also politically empowered. And they have the loudest voice. They have the first seat at the table. They're the ones whose concerns get heard first. They donated big bucks to the campaign, et cetera, et cetera. But David is saying, may my son Solomon deal justly and righteously from the top to the bottom. May he treat them all the same and bring justice to even the poor. That's it. That's David's prayer. That his son would rule with such spotless righteousness, a righteousness like God's very own. It is his prayer at the end of his life. It is the end for which God has been using David all along, to bring this kind of son and this kind of reign into the world. So now verses 3 through 17 is just a lengthy list of the many benefits that will come to the people in Israel and internationally if Solomon will rule this way. We can't look at all of them. I invite you to meditate on these in your own time, but let's look at a few of them. Look at verse 7. In his days may righteousness flourish and peace abound till the moon be no more. If he is righteous, he will motivate and spread righteousness among the people as well, and peace will be the result. Verse 12, for he delivers the needy when he calls, the poor and him who has no helper. Those who have no other recourse, nowhere else to turn, will find in this reign help for their needs. Look at verse 14. Save them from oppression and violence, redeem their life, for precious is their blood in his sight. And then verse 16, at the very end, he says, the people will blossom. The people will blossom like flowers that open up in the morning, just the right time to receive the bees and the insects and the sun and the rain of the day. They will open up in this beautiful way and thrive, just like the grass of the field. Now, I think there's a general principle here at work here. Just a general principle, if you think about this. Those who are in leadership, who have other people looking to them to make judgments, make decisions, lead and guide them, people in positions of leadership, depending on their moral character, will affect the flourishing of the people underneath them. Does that make sense? So if you're a boss, right, and you make promises and you keep them, you pay people a fair wage, you're honest and they see your honesty, there's a flourishing and a growing that happens amongst those people underneath you. If you're a parent, if you're honest, if you speak well to each other, husbands and wives, and you model this in front of your children, and you create a household where people know what the expectations are, and you don't play favorites, and you don't abuse your own power because if you have the loudest voice and you're the biggest person in the house, you can just kind of push people around. You don't live that way, but rather you live by righteousness and by just standards. Your children notice this, they flourish. If you're a team captain and you're honest and you play by the rules, you admit when you're wrong, you're able to compliment others when they're right. You don't always have to win the fight. What you have to do is preserve justice and righteousness, right? Your team will flourish. If, on the other hand, you make promises and you break them, people see you talk about telling the truth, and then they notice you tell little white lies along the way. Kids notice that, okay? Then your employees will flounder. Your children will wither. Your teammates will not follow. There's just a general principle here that the way you lead and your moral rectitude will affect the people under you. Or have you achieved positions of leadership to serve yourself? So that would be the opposite. But rather, leaders are called so that they may influence the good of others, not consolidate power in and of themselves. But like I said, that's just a general principle. There's a lot more here. Look at verse 4. In verse 4, he says, "May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor." Crush the oppressor. Look at verse 8. "May he have dominion from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth." What river is that? That's the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River is one of the rivers described in the Garden of Eden that flows out to water the whole land. And this imagery then of abundance of grain on the mountaintops, verse 16, all of this is the language of Eden. That in some way, if he rules this way, he will restore the Garden of Eden to earth. Moreover, look at verse 9. He says, "May the desert tribes bow down before him, and his enemies lick the dust." Now these two things, that his enemies will lick the dust in verse 9, and then that he will crush the oppressor in verse 4, I believe, is the language of Genesis 3:15. That through David's son, the serpent will be crushed. The one who got us kicked out of the Garden of Eden will now be defeated so that we can return to the Garden of Eden. And God promised this to Adam and Eve right away, and the same promise that he's made to David will affect the same ends. In other words, the one who is to crush the head of the serpent in Genesis 3:15, and the son of David who will restore righteousness to the earth and bring back an Edenic-like experience to the people are one and the same. The one to crush the head of the serpent and the one to rule over all the peoples on the throne of David are the same person. And this is what David sees his life is all about. To bring about a dynasty, to hand it over to a son who will be able to restore the original pre-fall condition to humanity if he rules with righteousness and justice. In other words, it's a cosmological vision. He's got the whole universe and setting the whole world back to rights in view when he prays this prayer. Which, of course, is the answer to the next question. Why would the Lord answer this prayer? Why would the Lord answer this prayer? In verses 18 through 19, we see it. Verses 18 and 19. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who alone does wondrous things. Blessed be his glorious name forever. May the whole earth be filled with his glory." In other words, David tacks that on at the end, not simply because it sounds like some pious language that you should throw on at the end of your prayer, right? But rather, he is saying that through my son, through this kind of righteous reign of my son, the glory of the Lord will spread throughout the earth. If the glory of the Lord is not known, if the glory of the Lord is not seen, it's because of the corruption of humanity. Therefore, as my Son spreads righteousness and justice, the glory of God is on the backs of that spreading of the glory of righteousness and justice. It will be through the Son of David that the glory of God will spread throughout the earth. And so what we see is what Jonathan Edwards said. What is the ends for which God created the earth? That he would display his glory publicly, and that rational creatures would see it and enjoy it and worship him through it. That's what Jonathan Edwards said. David's saying the exact same thing. But he's giving it a nuance. He's saying particularly what they need to see is the reign of my Son, his perfect righteousness, his perfect justice. And when people see that, that will be the mechanism through which the glory of God spreads throughout the world. That will be the means by which the raging nations are brought into submission to kiss the Son. So it seems like a simple prayer at the beginning. Give him righteousness and justice. Make him a moral, upright person. But at the end, we see it's actually the mechanism by which God will set the whole cosmos back to rights and solve the corruption of humanity and all the problems of the world. That's a big, big prayer. That's why it says his prayers are now ended. There's nothing else to pray. That's the final horizon of what David's life was always intended for, to hand it over to a son to accomplish that task. But Solomon, if you know your Bible, you know that he was good, but not great. He was not perfect. He was not righteous and just throughout his life. He worshiped foreign gods. He led Israel into idolatry. After him, the kingdom was split in half, and each subsequent son in the line of David and Solomon goes from bad to worst in their oppression and their unrighteous and their injustice. It seems as you read the Old Testament, David's prayer is not only not answered, the exact opposite happens. And unrighteousness and injustice prevail. Until the Babylonians come, don't they? And they destroy the house of Judah. They destroy the southern kingdom. They take the king in the line of David and all of his subjects and cart them off to Babylon. Someone said last week you studied Daniel 1. There you are, in Daniel 1. And so the Old Testament ends with a big question. When, if ever, will God fulfill this Psalm 72 prayer? And for hundreds of years, the Jews waited and expected. Some gave up waiting. Others pressed on. Some reinterpreted the Old Testament. What do you do when you're expecting something for hundreds of years and it doesn't come to pass? Well, turn to Matthew. Turn to the New Testament. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. First sentence of the New Testament. The very first sentence of the New Testament. Matthew begins with one of the most startling and awe-inspiring sentences in all of human literature. The book of the genealogy. Oh yes, a genealogy can be thrilling. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. With the very first sentence of the New Testament, Matthew is broadcasting that here comes the son of David. He is the son of David, the last son of David, the ultimate son of David, the son of David to which all the other Davidic promises have been heading. And Matthew is saying that I'm now going to tell you the story of how the son of David brings about the end of David, the goal and the purposes that God had set out for David. Turn to chapter 2, verse 11. Chapter 2, verse 11, I love it that we started with a Christmas song. That's totally God's providence, because when Jesus is born, as I'm sure you know, Magi come to visit him, right? And in chapter 2, verse 11, it says, going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother. They fell down and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Why is this significant? This is significant because these are Gentiles. These are people far from the covenant with Israel, from other lands, bringing treasures and gifts and falling down at the Son of David, which is exactly what we just read in Psalm 72. May the kings come and render tribute. May they bring gifts, verse 11, and fall down before him, and all nations serve him. Matthew is saying this is the beginning of the great pilgrimage of the nations to abandon their idolatry and finally submit to the Son of David, who is Jesus, who will rule in righteousness and justice unlike you've ever seen in the world before. And so as you read through the Gospel of Matthew, what do you read? You read righteousness and justice. On the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches what is true righteousness, right? There's all kinds of comparisons between the Pharisees and what he expects in terms of righteousness. Your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees. And in justice. And so throughout the gospel, he's caring for the poor. He's caring for the blind. He's caring for the needy. He's lifting up those. So then he lives out the very righteousness he just taught about. And as the story goes on, as you know, he ends up on the cross. But make no mistake about it. He's not dying for his own sins. He's dying for the unrighteousness and the injustice of his own people. The night before he was crucified, he said, "This is my body broken for you. This is the blood of the covenant poured out for many." That his broken body and his spilled blood is a sacrifice to atone for the unrighteous, injustice lifestyles of the sons of Adam. Turn to the end of Matthew. Turn to the end. We looked at the beginning, let's look at the end. Because on the third day, you know, Jesus is raised. We do not have a dead Messiah. We have a living Messiah, a resurrected Messiah. And when he comes back, when he comes out of the grave, he regathers the disciples that he still has. Judas is now gone. He's got 11 now. And in chapter 28, verse 18, at the very end, Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." I think we quote that verse so much. Missions conferences and to motivate people for missions. Amen. But I think we quote it so much that we may have lost the power of it. I mean, just think about that for a minute. He comes out of the grave and he tells his followers, "Heaven, earth, it all belongs to me. All authority in heaven, all authority on earth belongs to me now. I am the ruler of heaven and earth. I am currently the King of Kings, and I am the Lord of Lords." In other words, the story that began with the Son of David has now come to fruition. The prayer of David, the end of David, that one of his sons will rule all the nations in righteousness, like in Psalm 2, has now come to pass. Jesus is announcing the arrival of the permanent reign of the Son of David. All authority in heaven, all authority on earth has now been given to me. Then verse 19, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." In other words, the mechanism by which I will rule the nations is not with an army. It's not with political might. It's not with savvy international politicians or whatever. It's not through the vote. I will rule the nations, well, through my people. As my people go and they teach, what do they teach? What do they teach? Verse 20, teaching them all that I have commanded you. So all the righteousness and justice that I have taught throughout the Gospel of Matthew, I want you now to take into all the nations, and that will be the means through which my righteous rule will reach the ends of the earth. I won't do it with an army of angels. I won't do it with an army of anything. You may be poor, you may be weak, you may be beleaguered, you may be without house and home. The Son of Man had nowhere to lay his head. You understand? But as you go, you are my emissaries. You are the instruments in my hand for fulfilling Psalm 72, setting the cosmos back to rights, the means by which the glory of God will now go and spread throughout the earth. That's how the psalm ended, right? So how has God answered the prayer of Psalm 72? The answer is by resurrecting Jesus. And the resurrected Jesus now says, you got to go. You got to go. And you got to teach the nations everything that I've commanded you. I will rule heaven and earth through my people as they teach, as they open their mouths, they tell their neighbors, they tell their friends about my righteous, just rule. And so the reign of the eternal Son of David has broken into history. But it has not broken the mold of history. In other words, that old sinful corruption of humanity is still deeply ensconced the world over. So turn with me now to the book of Revelation. First book of the New Testament, now the last book of the New Testament. God has fulfilled Psalm 72 in Jesus, and he will fulfill Psalm 72 in Jesus. In Revelation chapter 19, we read of the glorious return of Christ. We believe, I believe, I don't speak for you, you tell me if you believe this later, that the dead man is fully resurrected and fully alive, and that he will return to his earthly kingdom visibly and in glory and in power. And chapter 19 of Revelation, verse 11, describes that. And look what it says. He says, "Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges." You hear that? That's an echo of Psalm 72, that in righteousness he judges and he makes war. He's coming again to judge all those who have rejected his righteous rule and rebelled against his righteousness and justice, and then also to vindicate those who have upheld his righteousness and justice and promoted it throughout the world. Then look at chapter 21. Chapter 21, verse 26. At this time, they, which in the context here is the kings of the earth, will bring into it the glory and honor of the nations. In other words, what started with the Magi and is continuing right now through the spread of the gospel through the church to the nations will be climaxed when Jesus returns and the nations bring their glories and lay them down before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Then there will be a new creation. And then God's glory will again fill the earth as it did before the first fall. That will be the moment where the universe is finally and ultimately and irrevocably set back to its right order. Humanity refines its place as the image of God in the creation, and through humanity, with Jesus at the head, righteousness and justice will prevail forever, never to be denied again. And so perfect righteousness and justice will rule forever through Jesus Christ in the new creation. And we long for that new creation, and that is why we despise racism. That is why we reject sexism. That is why we desire righteousness and justice in our cultural institutions now, because there's no racism in the new creation. There's no sexism in the new creation. But righteousness will prevail and penetrate and propagate throughout the new creation because Jesus will be its ruler. Therefore, these concerns are in our hearts now. We're citizens of that new creation already. And so the concerns of the King, the righteous King, are the concerns for us as well. They're in our DNA and we desire them now. Moreover, as mentioned, Matthew 28, Jesus is Lord now. He has already broken into this world with his kingdom, and we are its citizens. Therefore, there will be no racism, there will be no sexism, there will be no injustice, there will be no unrighteousness within the community of the redeemed. That's the vision. The reason is because Jesus is our ruler. As he goes, we go. For Jesus is the end of the Davidic line. Yet the world outside is still very much fallen. And we aren't going to change it through social, political, or economic action, because the fallenness of humanity can't be fixed by those things. I'll repeat that. While Christ rules over the church and spreads his righteousness and justice through us, as we learn from him and spread those concepts in the gospel, in our lifestyles, nonetheless, the fallen world will continue with its corruption. But that corruption cannot be fixed through social, political, or economic action, because the fallenness of humanity is never fixed by those things. Rather, it will be fixed through the gospel now, and when our faith becomes sight, when we see him riding on the clouds and every eye behold him. In the meantime, nonetheless, the church, every local church, can be a counter society that models what our King is like. So we put our hope not in princes, but we call princes to righteousness. We put our hope not in marches, but we can't be ignorant of the places of inequity and injustice that are still ensconced in our culture. Just can't be ignorant of that. There's a song that I hope you don't sing here because I'm about to criticize it. Blessed be your name when the world is all as it should be. I say, what? How can you sing that? That is not a Christian song, because the world is never all as it should be. There's a problem in the world. The unrighteousness and injustice of humanity still pervade our world, even as Jesus has authority over it all. Our song should be, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. There's still more. We should have a holy dissatisfaction with the state of the world so long as Jesus' righteous justice is still rejected in corners of it. But in the end, we don't just curse the darkness. We don't just go around complaining about the world, but we tell the world about this perfect fulfillment of Psalm 72. Jesus, the perfectly righteous one, who rules his people and demonstrates righteousness and justice to them so they can live these lifestyles as well. And so through the church, Jesus reigns. And through the church, he is spreading his righteous rule, bringing in an international worshiping and witnessing community through the spread of the gospel on our lips until the day our faith is made sight and no one stands any further in the way of his unsullied, eternal, righteous reign over a new creation. Let's pray together.
This has been a presentation of Castle View Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. For more information about our church, please visit castleview.org.